everyone. Shall we start with Dr. O'Neill? Would you like to share a little bit, briefly summarize this article? If you want to share the screen, you can click and share your PowerPoint with us.
Okay, I'll do that. I just want to say I'm grateful to all the panelists for being here, even though they make it sound as though I have much more influence over them than I really do. So I'll start with screen sharing. And here's a very brief overview of the article for those who perhaps haven't had a chance to read it yet. And it might be a bit of a reminder, a bit of a spark to our discussion with the panel.
So I draw a distinction at the beginning of the paper between two orientations to the future that we can take in a design science. One I call building for the future, which is essentially modest. It looks at a future, a near-term future that is likely coming, and just attempts to be prepared for it or to make small improvements upon it. The other orientation is building the future, in which we look at the future that we think is coming and say, oh no, we can do a lot better than that. And through a grand act of design, we try to assert control over the future and essentially put a future in place that otherwise is not likely to happen. We have this kind of visionary design in the learning sciences. The earliest example that I can think of is Seymour Papert's Mindstorms, but there have been many others. And really the question I pursue in the paper is what it's going to take for us to get better at doing this kind of visionary design over time, which means studying it better. And there I think we have some things to learn from architecture scholars, because they've done a very good job at studying visionary design and its consequences over long spans of time. All the projects, the three that I consider in the paper, come from the Modernist era, which was a very idealistic time in architecture. Starting around the 1920s, architects didn't just try to explore a new style of building or new building materials. They really were aiming to reform society itself. This quote from Glaser really asserts that modernism was about providing better living places for people, better access to green space and air and light. And a motto that I play upon in the title of the paper, Form Follows Function, is often associated with Louis Sullivan. So I don't have time for all three of these modernist projects, but I'll talk about Pruitt-Igoe, one of the earlier ones. It was a public housing project in the U.S., built in St. Louis, Missouri, in order to be prepared for a future that they believed was coming. They believed that by 1970 the population of St. Louis would expand to 1 million people. Largely due to an influx of rural poor coming to industrial centers like St. Louis in order to find better employment. But they realized that they didn't have good places for the newcomers to live. And so Pruitt-Igoe was intended to solve that problem. The design team was led by Minoru Yamasaki, who was no amateur, and it integrated some very innovative design features, which I'll illustrate now. So this is an undated government photo of what Pruitt-Igoe looked like from the air around its completion. I judge that from the state of the landscaping. It was a forest of 11-story high-rises set not far from the center of St. Louis. There was quite a bit of green space in between the high-rises. It's a modernist hallmark. And if we zoom in a bit, you can start to see the evidence of one of the unique design features. Each one of the buildings has, every 3 floors, a darker band of windows. And inside those windows were what the architects called internal galleries. They were essentially enclosed, heated, and lit public spaces. They were intended to be shared by all the people who lived in the complex, and this was a way for the designers to address a problem with high-rise living still today, which is that people don't really get to know very many of their neighbors. What they did was not only provide this space, but then they rigged the elevators so that they would stop only at the internal galleries, and they were only every 3 floors. So that meant that 2/3 of the occupants would have to take the elevator up and walk either up one flight or down one flight to get to their own units. So by forcing people to pass through this public space, they would create this sort of instant community. And you can see from this artist's rendering what they expected to happen. There are potted plants in here, kids on tricycles. Here's a playpen with a little baby. He looks like he just lost his teddy bear, poor guy. But unfortunately, this is not what happened. After the buildings were built, the internal galleries were still pretty pleasant spaces. One of the early occupants described her place as a poor man's penthouse, and by many accounts, the people who lived in Pruitt-Igoe at the beginning felt very, very fortunate to live there. Unfortunately, however, that predicted population boom of 1 million people by 1970 never really materialized. I think the population of St. Louis topped out at not quite 400,000 people in 1970. And because they built all of the towers at one time, and there were many, many vacancies, the vacant units became havens for criminal activity, and these internal galleries became pretty unpleasant places to be. So something that was intended to strengthen the social fabric actually became a sort of an obstacle. People said that running through the internal galleries with a bag of groceries became like running a gauntlet. After 18 years in occupation, this is what eventually happened to Pruitt-Igoe. The reason we have this film footage is because the place had become so infamous that the destruction of the first few towers was a nationally televised event. And it deserved to be because, as it was later estimated, the destruction of Pruitt-Igoe after only 18 years of occupation resulted in an overall loss to taxpayers of something like $300 million. So, I believe there are some takeaways here for learning scientists in how we study and how we learn to do visionary design better. I think it's really important to recognize that building the future has unique potentials, but it also has special risks and challenges, two of which are illustrated by Pruitt-Igoe. One is reliance on poor predictions, and the other is unintended consequences, such as we saw with the internal galleries. Most learning scientists that I know, I think, would agree that form should follow function, which is why trying to design things that will shape the distant future can become problematic. Because when you think you're building the future, you can rationalize almost anything and almost any form. A lot of the empirical discipline of design just goes out the window. Frank Lloyd Wright had this lovely quip that doctors bury their mistakes, but architects have to cover theirs with vines. So architects have this unique advantage in their work, which is that their artifacts are very large and easy to observe, and they are open to public scrutiny mostly. Whereas that's not automatically the case with the sort of design we do in the learning sciences. And documenting things in the learning sciences is crucially important if we're going to be able to reflect on visionary design, because we don't even have to pick up a shovel to bury our mistakes. If we fail to write them up, they'll just be forgotten over time. So I argue that we should be taking a longer view of visionary design. It would make it a whole lot easier to teach about design in the learning sciences. A big element of the kind of scholarship that I think we need would get very serious about the unintended consequences of visionary and even more modest build for the future design efforts.
Thanks, Dr. Kevin O'Neill. So any response from the panel?
Which order should we go in? Should we start with Rogers and then proceed through Brian and Josh?
Sure, sure. This is a great paper. I think I sort of found it almost by accident some time back and sent Kevin a note. And that's probably why he pressed me into being here today. But so I just want to really appreciate that he had sort of the breadth of interest and vision to look across fields and think about how design practices work. So I'm going to kind of jump to one of my last points first, which is that I'm kind of interested in how we teach design. So, certainly in learning sciences, like in the graduate program I'm affiliated with and other programs, we have courses on design, and they're very nice, they're very good, but I think at Vanderbilt University in particular, there's an effort to teach design to the whole undergraduate body as an immersive experience, which often puts students, I'm teaching some of those courses, it puts students out into the community in a way that really foregrounds and raises these issues about whose fantasy gets into design, like what voices are present in design. So one of the things on my mind, which would be cool to talk about here and maybe do something about, is for the International Society to think a little bit about how design might be taught. My own view is that there are many, many design practices. So Kevin, in the work that you do that looks across, landscape architecture, which is not the same as the architecture of buildings, which is not the same as urban planning. Those are all different design practices and cultures. They all operate different imaginaries. I think product design is another. Information system design, they're called information architectures because often they have a more complex infrastructure than built architectures, right? So I just think it's really interesting. And I think our field could, in some sense, provide some leadership there. It's not as though people haven't been doing this, and people have been writing about design sciences or design cultures since the 1970s. And so that stuff is really interesting. I wanted to actually point to an area of literature that I'm not sure people in learning sciences are reading very much, and there's not a ton of it, but people do design schools. Literally, they design learning environments. And so with some colleagues, several years ago, we set up a collaboration with architecture faculty at the University of Melbourne and learned a lot of things from them. I wanted to sort of point out two things. One of which was kind of sobering, which is in the world of design and architecture, particularly academic architecture, which is sort of not the same as meat and potatoes workaday architecture, they work on timelines and funding cycles that are radically different than learning sciences research. So for them, like, the concept comes early. They think about something very general for the purpose of designing something very specific. And if they can draw the money together to actually get that thing built, then for the most part, they're done, right? Everything stops at that point. So there are post-occupancy studies, but they're actually not very interesting. And so while it's true that these built structures stay around for a long time, just the whole professional worlds of these two disciplines, learning sciences and architecture, are organized very differently. But they do overlap from time to time. And one concept that I thought I would propose is that in sort of the design of built spaces for delivering instruction, there's kind of a concept that you would design things in a responsible way, almost to code. And so there's responsible design, right? You would design it so that it's accessible. You would design it so that it is well lit. And that's sophisticated stuff. It's not simple. You would design it so that the air is conditioned properly and kids aren't getting headaches. You can see the board and stuff like that. So responsible design is one cluster of issues. But what we learned from our colleagues in Australia is that there's another sense of response-able design, which is the design should be flexible enough that people can enact different forms of pedagogy in those spaces. And if you push that further, you would begin to think, well, maybe those should be designed as spaces where students can work together to learn, and also where teachers could work together to learn. So I actually think learning sciences in relation to the design and layout of the built structures of environments could be opened up. That could be a stronger area. A number of people are going to say things about participatory design, so I'm going to kind of step past that. There's a very nice special issue in Cognition and Instruction in 2016 led by Megan Bang and Shireen Basagi, that I would recommend. Their introductory article is great. I wanted to end on unintended consequences, which I just think that's like a fantastic thing to look for, and your paper really encourages us to do that. So for me, like unintended consequences, they're often unintended because we haven't taken like a system image view in Don Norman's sense of what it is we're designing into. So when we're not just designing for the future, we're designing for a pretty vibrant present, right? And so I think many of the failures in learning sciences or in any design field are because people haven't thought very much about what the life world of users is like. And so things show up and they don't fit very well, and people just abandon them. Some design projects are so big that everyone is forced to use them. Right now, we're struggling with what it means to opt in and give Facebook our data, but think about what Google's scraping from all of us. So Google's much, much, much larger than Facebook, right? So anyway, I just thought, unintended consequences, there are some really great case studies of it. The one I think I'll just foreground two. So one is a recent book by Christos Sims. The title of it is Disruptive Fixation, School Reform and the Pitfalls of Techno-Idealism. And it's an ethnographic study of building a high school around digital media arts. And the take home there is that, Robert Yin might call this a societal rival, but basically what happens is the school operates to sort of reproduce all the privileges that it was designed not to make happen, right? So there's kind of a reinforcement politics aspect to this it's kind of the bummer. It's a real downside to these kinds of large-scale designs. And Christo's book is really interesting. For me, there's this great chapter on spatial fixation in which he goes into how, in the larger scale of how a school fits into families, parents are constantly cultivating and arranging where their kids go in time and space, right? And so there are processes of spatial production that just kind of take over what the school is able to do. I think it's kind of a cool idea. The second one is a paper I wrote with Katie Taylor, and I'm up here in the Seattle area teaching with her, and so I thought I would mention it. We did a study in which, after like a year-long ethnography of urban planners managing public input to city neighborhood character design sessions, we found there were no kids anywhere in these conversations. And so we set about trying to push kids' voices into this, and eventually we ended up having kids gather data about their own mobility in the city and build what we called desire maps, which they presented to the mayor's office. And to our surprise, because we had no way of controlling this, some of their mapped routes for using bicycles, which they just built out of discarded parts, got painted on the city streets. It was like, holy moly, we actually painted something on the streets. Couldn't believe that as an outcome. That was not part of our pre-post design, right? And the second thing that happened that I thought was just kind of bizarre but cool is that the planners weren't so much interested in what we have to say, but they sucked the methods out of our work. Some other kind of taking the marrow out of bones or something. And they very quickly were using our methods at a very large scale to encourage people to document their own mobility and find cultural assets in the city that they wanted to preserve and send those in. So they turned our methods into a survey method for themselves, which were both okay. We had no way of anticipating them, partly because, I'll just end on this point, we were designing for a future without fully grasping what the present amounted to. And so these were things that were just, at the moment, they were bigger than us, and it just pulled pieces of our study into what I thought were productive use. It doesn't always happen that way. That's the end of my comments.
Thanks, Professor Rajesh Hall. So anyone to add on or continue this discussion or comments?
First, I want to say, Kevin, I've enjoyed this paper since I remember we talked about it early when you were starting to work a little bit, pieces of it, and trying to think about some of the design history aspects of this. And so it is something that, it's a paper that I've assigned to my graduate students in the last couple of years since it's come out. And I think it's a really important piece to talk about sort of design and what that means in the learning sciences. So I spent a little bit of time. Some of you know I spent 4 years, I don't remember when, I guess that was 2010 to around 2014. It was about 4 years where I was the Dean of Continuing Education at Rhode Island School of Design. And actually part of the reason I did that, I actually left my position at the time. I was in an information school at Penn State. And I took the position at RISD partially to actually think about these issues. I wanted to sort of understand, although our fields, and I was in an information school as a learning scientist, and people were talking a lot about design. And so I thought, well, what better way to try to understand a little bit more about this but actually going to one of the preeminent schools of design. And so, you know, RISD might private, if I recall right, it was about 21 majors. I actually ran the continuing education group, so I did, I sort of ran all the programs that were youth and adult programs that were non-major. So I saw and experienced a little bit about all these things, and really saw, I think, you know, to sort of build on what Roger said, like my interest in sort of teaching design really peaked when I started to go, each one of these sort of, there's similarities across these fields, and yet they obviously have their own very different kinds of things, often very dependent on materials. Perhaps materials and often size and scale, sort of what their goals were. Definitely in the undergraduate and graduate programs, a very kind of social because not necessarily just to make aesthetic things, but actually because we do have these messages. In some cases, certainly when you're thinking about the design aspects, what people were going, how in fact can we sort of change the conditions of the world? So many of those people who were doing design were really trying to think about it from their localized, what is my field, whether I'm graphic or product design, or whether I'm, you know, furniture or something like that. How do I make a difference and actually sort of change the conditions that people live in? So it was a very interesting opportunity. One thing I noted there, obviously, was, in fact, when I got there, they said, so you're an education person who has come to a design school. And so the first thing they said, I said, well, I do design. I design educational technologies, and I did that. And they said, no, that's not actually design. That's sort of like whatever kind of design. He comes to design schools and looks at us and then writes papers about us. So I assume they meant, are you sort of in the scholarly field of design sciences and trying to understand sort of more about what practice means? So there was a little bit of, I'd say, what is this outside person who's come here and in fact, I'd say as someone who claims to be in design. And so some of that understanding was not, you know, you're in a very, whatever design you call it is not the design it's not the design we're looking for. But gradually over time, as I started to work with and kind of gain the trust of faculty and other administration, these kinds of questions of how to look across these different fields and understand more about, well, what are the similarities and the differences, and how do we sort of take advantage of those things, certainly in the studio space, right? So how can we think about what are the kinds of things that we want designers writ large to understand versus when do you start to specialize into the particular forms and materials that you work with? And I think, Kevin, some of that is reflected in this paper, is that in many cases that's, you know, am I designing for the near present, or am I trying to sort of make a very, very far kind of futuristic vision? I also spent a little bit of time at some point in my career. I can't hold a job, some of you know that. So at some point in my career, I was also faculty at the MIT Media Laboratory. And so part of when I read this, is thinking of, I mean, I had the pleasure of working with Seymour Papert quite a bit while I was at the lab. And there certainly was you know, I think it's a fair case to say that Seymour was someone who said, I'm going to transform what education looks like, or it's certainly, I am interested in trying to do that and to try to figure out how to do that on scales that are not small at all, but really trying to sort of do very big scale transformation. And using his view of the computer and sort of having kids program those machines as part of that vision. And so it's, you know, it was always interesting there. And I think, you know, one of the things I certainly fell into there was trying to say, like, you know what, I will try to build interventions that are 10 to 15 years out. I'm going to assume that this is the future. And I'm going to see what happens along the way. And you know, I would say that very few of those, you know, I don't see any of those necessarily. I see little pieces here and there of things that we may have tried to do in terms of sort of pushing some technological boundaries and things like that. So I mean, my sense was that in fact, out of trying to do a lot of that visionary stuff, I think it's important to try to do it. But I think actually one of the points that you make in the paper is really trying to document that work and trying to understand sort of, okay, if we're going to shoot for what could 30 years from now look like, how are the ways that we can start to make sure that we document some of that stuff so that other people don't make those same mistakes? I mean, one of the things we used to say at the Media Lab when corporate sponsors would come, sometimes we'd say, you know, you're actually funding us so that we can make mistakes, and it's just cheaper that we do it quickly versus you having to figure it out as a revenue generating organization. So sometimes we really were in the business of kind of saying like, well, let's try something kind of wild and just see where it goes, mostly because there may be some good ideas there. And again, part of trying to do that was to pull out, and in fact, sometimes go on, what are the unintended consequences that might not be so negative? I mean, because sometimes those, of course, appear too, where things would happen and we go, wow, you know, we didn't expect kids to do that with the machinery. So let's go back and try to build there as opposed to sort of focusing on our grand vision. Let's actually listen to teachers and students as we're working with them. You know, so that just to say one more point about that, you also make a suggestion in the paper, Kevin, that is about sort of essentially don't don't go chasing technological waterfalls, I guess. And that's, you know, that was something that I don't know that we necessarily did that at the Media Lab, but it's something that I see and I encounter quite a bit, where it's the new technology comes and it is the transformer. And I don't necessarily think that's something we see a lot in the field, in the learning sciences community, but I think out in many other communities, sometimes that happens, right? Where it is, hey, look, it's virtual reality, got to build virtual reality. Hey, now it's right. And some of that, I think, obviously can make sense if it's based in, again, sort of what we understand about these that we think about, but how to situate those technologies in some kind of context so that it's not just, here's the new thing and let's kind of chase it. I remember, you know, over the years, I remember things like, hey, look, it's Google Wave. That's going to change education. Remember that one? No, you didn't, because that was like 2 seconds. Second Life is going to be your third. Nope, that's not. No, right? And so the history of those kinds of things coming along and saying, well, these are they're going to change the landscape of everything. Obviously, if not, none of that's happened. And so anyway, I'll turn it over to Josh, and but I think there's a lot of great things here to think about, Kevin. So I appreciate you putting together the paper, and I'm happy to be here as part of the panel.
So I like the way, Brian, you just mentioned a whole bunch of big, important futures of the past that lasted a very short time. And it sort of points to the fact that I think, Kevin, you kind of crafted this argument that it's about the relationship between designers and futures. Are we designing for the future, or are we designing the future? But it seems to me like time is much more complicated in these stories that we're telling than just that it's about designers and futures. And so Brian's stories of little short pasts that were about big futures that never happened, it shows how much more complicated it is. So like from you know, Edward Sojat talks about real and imagined journeys through Los Angeles, and in those real and imagined journeys, past, present, and future are way scrambled up like scrambled eggs. You know, there are many, many complex relationships. And you know, in dialogical analysis from a Bakhtin perspective, every story that we are telling is in a genre that has certain space-time relationships packaged up in it. And that's kind of where I went with reading your piece. It really got me fascinated. One of the reasons that I was thrilled to see your piece come to JLS was because, as you know, we've talked about this a lot. It's just not enough historically informed learning sciences research in all along the spectrum of what that might look like. So here, you know, you talked about sort of looking at Pruitt-Igoe and what they thought when they built Pruitt-Igoe. And then you just showed us with, it's good to have an explosion video in any webinar. And I thought that was good that you showed us where Pruitt-Igoe ended up. But in the time between when I read your piece first and today, I went and heard a talk and got a book by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law, in which he talks about the history of public housing policy in the United States and casts a different view on thinking about this. You emphasized thinking about technology and emphasized in both the Brasilia example and the Pruitt-Igoe example, and misreading population trends and misreading how people would use the spaces and what stairwells were going to be good for. Rothstein's book really emphasizes how public policy, including and especially public housing policy, was designed to segregate populations on race. And we have a way of talking about de facto segregation versus de jure segregation. And Rothstein kind of pokes a hole in the idea of de facto segregation. He points out that places like St. Louis and Chicago and other urban centers post-World War II had very integrated, racially integrated urban slums. And the program to get rid of the slums also was a program to segregate those populations black and white. And Pruitt-Igoe was segregated black and white. One development was for black people only, one development was for white people only. They're building a future of racial segregation that was realized, even though the projects didn't last, 20 years or so, less than 20, not very long at all. And so even after the explosion of those buildings, you see highly segregated neighborhoods in St. Louis, and especially in the suburbs and exurbs, which create this opportunity for wealth creation that has radically diverged for white families and black families who were working class in 1940. So I think that when we talk about this building the future and building for the future, one of the points that Rothstein makes is one about the nature of history. We tell the stories now and it feels like we're exposing a hidden truth about planned segregation, but of course we're not exposing something that wasn't known at the time. It was widely known at the time. But because our discourse has moved in the direction of colorblind, anti-racist narratives, it was important to cover up that fact. And so I think when we do history within learning sciences, we can expose pasts that are hidden from us now. And that by exposing those pasts, we think about the imaginaries, like Roger said, the imagined futures of the past, which sheds a different light on the imagined futures of the present. And I think that we just need to do a lot more work in history in the learning sciences to understand, it feels to me very much like who is imagining this future, in what context of power and the ability to accomplish these designs. And I think that a lot of people now are really, as Rogers was talking about, in terms of participatory design, really trying to shake up how we think about these things that are just assumed, like that someone from the outside will come in and design an environment that's going to change people, as opposed to designing from the inside or affiliating ourselves with people and designing with them from the inside. And I feel like Megan Bang and Ananda Marine have been really showing the way on that. Shirin Vosaji, as Rogers had mentioned. Jose Melendez, one of the students coming out of our program, really has changed my thinking about we mean by a design team and how we should think about who's the designer. And Chris Gutierrez, Susan Giroux, Lori Rubel, there are a lot of people doing this work that says, let's look at the room where it happens. Who gets to be in the deciding space? And what does it reveal about us when we tell stories about design from the outside and from the inside? I'll just say one more thing. I know there's a lot we could say. I loved the example of Lafayette Park with the trees. The fact that planting trees was such a key piece of the design there, and that the trees grew big, and before they grew big, it was really a hideously ugly place. And that once the trees grew big, you couldn't see the parked cars so well. There were these shady homes. As you point out, they survived the riots in Detroit. And I think that has something to say about techno focus in our designs and our relationship with nature. And there's always been, to me, a strand of learning sciences thinks in the long term and thinks about designs that can take root in an ecology that they're built for and that can grow over time. It's really the opposite of saying, I'll build it quick and then we'll scale, right? And so I think, I think of Beth Warren and Roseberry and Carol Lee in particular, as people who for decades, have been building things in the ecology of teachers who do work with learners and building things that can grow over time. They may or may not have technology associated with them, but the technologies that are there can take root in communities of teachers, in grade cycles at high schools or at elementary schools, and grow over time. Maybe in your piece, Kevin, you would have called those designing for the future, sort of the way you describe reciprocal reading, reciprocal teaching. And yet they're also designing for the present, designing with an eye toward the past, and designing for a future that is emerging out of the present, rather than one that is radically separated from the present. And I think that those are subtle differences there. And I should probably just shut up and let the conversation happen. So thanks for this.
So I have a question here for the author. So actually, the author well distinguished two orientations of design towards the future, build for the future and build the future. So I'm wondering whether there is an alternative to the two orientations, or in some learning sciences projects, sometimes we have a mix of some combination of the two orientations at the same time, or along the in the long term. So maybe sometimes we have a very big vision for doing a very big design project, but it may turns out that that big project cannot work quite well, but at least we can get something by working on this very big vision. So do you envision some, or do you see some learning science and design projects that kind of a mix of some combination of the two orientations, rather than we only talk about the two extreme orientations towards design? So I'm asking the question to the author.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's a good question. In fact, I might say that it's a question that we've all been sort of swirling around with the panel. What I would say is that I try to keep the distinction clean, as clean as I can without falsifying things in the paper, because I do believe that there are these special risks and challenges to attempting to build the future. And so as Brian was saying, that brings in a need to document our work in a careful way if we're going to learn from it. I think in reality, people's minds slide very easily between the two orientations, and that's why sometimes we don't realize that we are trying to build the future. In one of the cases in the paper, the city of Brasilia, exactly this thing happens. The architects of Brasilia seem to slide between the two orientations without necessarily seeming to be aware of it. Your other question, though, or part of your question, really asks about whether there can be, through positive unintended consequences maybe, whether there can be good spin-offs from attempts to build the future that do last. And again, I think Brian gave some examples of that, and Rogers gave some examples of that. I don't know whether it means, I guess the question I would have, when I teach, Roger and Brian both talked about our needs to teach the kind of design that we do in learning sciences. And in the back of my head, I think I was led to writing this paper because of the challenges I experienced in trying to teach about some of the work we do in the learning sciences and its long-term consequences. So I teach every year about, for instance, about I don't call this build the future work, but an innovative work on cognitive tutors, and I'm able to teach about the long arc of that work only because I've followed it really closely over my career. There's a lot that I wind up teaching that isn't written down anywhere, but I think is really important, and somebody should be writing a history of the whole cognitive tutoring agenda. But anyway, so I think there is a way, and well, maybe Brian would like to speak to this, but there is a sense in which people often say, well, yeah, that big vision, it didn't pan out. But there were these spin-offs that were worthwhile, and we probably wouldn't have had those had it not been for indulging ourselves in the big futurist vision, even if it didn't come to pass as we expected. I'm a little ambivalent about that. You know, I certainly don't. I think that as long as there are big pots of money around for people to apply for, there are going to be these big futurist projects, because if there's one thing that futurist visions are useful for, it's justifying a big budget. So we're going to continue to have it, we're going to continue to, in our minds, to slide back and forth between these two orientations. But to me, it really is, I'm flexible, I'm willing to hear arguments on this, but to me, it really is a binary distinction, or something close to it. I don't see much of a spectrum here, although the real world of people's design thinking and design practice is very, very muddy and includes both. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. So may I follow up? But like you just mentioned that, you know, maybe people slide very easily between the two orientations. So if that is the case, you know, in reality, it's not black or white. It's a kind of mix, not a very clear distinction. And if that is the case, is that a useful distinction? You know, like maybe it's not very useful for us to distinguish the two things, if in reality it's not that clear that you know, two orientations are separated from each other.
Well, I think it's a useful distinction because of the implications it has for how we wind up documenting our work or enabling others to document our work, and then how later generations of scholars are able to examine it and learn some of the big lessons that are possible. When Brian and I were both at Northwestern, I worked on a project called Learning Through Collaborative Visualization, big NSF-funded initiative. And I remember sitting in a meeting once, and we were gathering tons and tons of data on these high school students we were working with. You know, way more in some sense than we could ever analyze. Common enough problem in the learning sciences. And somebody asked, gee, should we be gathering any more data? Is there anything we're not gathering that we should be gathering? And I sat back in my chair and I said, I think the way we should think about this problem is to ask ourselves what we would want to know to write the history of CoViz 10 years after the fact.
Okay.
And then what would we need to be gathering now in order to tell that story? And this way of thinking has been with me since that time, since the early 90s. And I still think that it's a good way for learning scientists to think about their work. How do you want to tell the long story? What do you need to capture now in order to make that possible?
Can I interject another case here that I think our field has, but it hasn't been mentioned before, and that's Mike Cole's work to develop the fifth dimension activity structure that persists today. So Mike and Olga Vasquez and others, and Bill Branton in the Appalachian region did a lot of work on that. Chris Gutierrez has done a lot of work on that. Susan Giroux is now running those clubs, but they're all over the place. And so one of the criteria that Mike was very concerned about was whether or not these things were sustainable. So one of the questions he wanted to ask of design research is, are the things that we build sustainable, and under what conditions would they be sustainable? And, you know, just in cartoon form, I thought what was super clever about what Mike did was he was friends with the University of California president at the time, and he convinced the guy to, you know, create incentives for faculty to build these structures on the one hand, so that, for example, in an undergraduate psychology program, you needed students to have an experience of actual living children outside the university. So they would go and they would do field work. So there was an incentive for the university to do it. And then in community centers, parents wanting their children to be around vibrant young folks in a safe place, there was a reason for community centers to do this. And then they built incentives in at the UC system, and these club structures took off all over the place. They weren't all the same, but they're those kind of basic, you know, functional relations that met people's needs were there. And that was one of his reasons, that was one of his arguments for why it was sustainable. And I think that's a really interesting case for learning sciences. I mean, how would you think that through at design time?
Yeah, because the default, well, I shouldn't say this, I don't want to paint the field with too broad a brush, but I think there's an awful lot of what I believe Josh alluded to earlier, which is you build the thing, you assume that if it's really, really great and you can produce enough evidence of that, then you can convince people to start paying for it. Whereas what was so brilliant about, part of what was so brilliant about Mike's approach to sustainability was to say, no, the community organization where the after school club is hosted, they have to pay for the site coordinator from the very beginning, from day one. I agree with you. I really celebrate that work too, and I teach it now in my doctoral program.
I'll just say what I was thinking about. It's just a swirl of questions, swirl of ideas that I had in my mind. But I just really wanted to push on this notion of unintended consequences and how realistic it is that we're able to predict. It reminds me of our favorite scientist, maybe yours and mine, Kevin, David Suzuki in Canada. And he said, about engineering, genetic engineering, he said, years ago, there's no way to test the combination, all possible combinations and permutations of genetic engineering products such that we can say, that 100% that in the future things will be good and beneficial. And, and it also in my own work in complex systems ideas, emergence happens. It's all this idea of self-organization. And so we can do this kind of partnering and making sure that we document. But there's always this element of randomness and uncertainty in systems that are really just hard to get our hands around. And, Brian mentioned a few of these, like, these great things that we thought we were developing, and like in Second Life. And then it's something like if you go onto Google Scholar, Second Life has what, like 2 million or 1 million, papers on this, right? It's crazy. And it's useless at some level. It isn't a pedagogical approach or a platform that we're going to use continually. So I guess that's a point that I wanted to make. Also wanted to say, so David Suzuki would argue that we need to just slow down with how we build things, and test and test and test, and yet at the same time, the system, the education system moves very fast or slowly in that, the reforms will stay, this kind of standardized testing and all this kind of thing, right? Which is where, when you think about design thinking, design fast, fail fast, implement fast, fail fast, something's got to stick. So in all of what I just said was, we've got these larger systems. Everybody's been talking about those systems. And yet there are these variations in them that we just we can't get our heads around. And I just wanted to hear, Kevin, your ideas about this notion of random variation, uncertainty, and maybe everybody else on the panel. That was just a question I had. I'll stay for 5 minutes more. I'm so interested in this question.
Talk fast, Kevin.
Okay. Well, I'll talk fast because I'm not sure I have a lot to say, Susan, about this. I mean, I admire David Suzuki as well. And I think one of the things that's sort of woven through the paper, I was trying to be very even-handed in the argument and make space for the orientation of building the future and really thinking about how we can learn to do it better over time as a field. But it's kind of hard to avoid for me personally, the conclusion that slower moving incremental work is just healthier. But not everybody wants to hear that, and I really have come to the conclusion myself that we're going to keep seeing build the future approaches. So the question really, as a field, should be, how are we going to learn to do it better? We are learning scientists, after all. How are we going to learn to do this better? And that's kind of the way I've tried to go about this in my teachings. I really try to tell these sort of human stories about agendas that last decades, and really have, it's part of an important part of, I think, the students' identity formation, that they understand that they're going to live these long story arcs themselves. Right? If they're fortunate, their own work is going to have this kind of staying power. Maybe they'll build the next fifth dimension, right? They should hope that they will, right? But even, that's in the special issue that Mike Cole and Bill Penuel and I worked on for JLS a little while ago. I quoted this really great line from Mike, which is that he had for his research team, which is, they're studying successful innovations until they fail. They were ready for the fifth dimension to fail. They weren't desperate to make it live. They had put serious thought into sustainability, and it turned out that the thing really lasted, but they were ready to pull the plug. So I don't know. I think one of the big things, and maybe Brian would like to comment on this, but one of the big things about sort of an underlying theme in some of the big architectural failures that I write about in the paper is this, that there was a big element of rush connected to funding. Brasilia had to be built in 3 years because that was the term limit for a president in Brazil at the time. And Pruitt-Igoe, they should not have, in retrospect, one of the biggest mistakes was to build all of the towers at once. But, that was, they would probably say that's the way the government grant was structured. And, there was a time horizon on the money. And so they had to build the whole thing at one time. It would be great if we could restructure some of these things so that we could build more slowly and more responsively. So that we would have more response-able design, the way Rogers was saying. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I would just challenge the idea that incremental, slow, and low impact have to go together, and that sudden, big, expensive, and technologically exciting have to go together somehow, and that radical, quick change is often the result of things that seem to be small and organic and incremental. And we can just look at the changes in discourses about schooling have changed radically over the last 20 years. Very often there are small things that change those discourses. In Chicago, there are groups of teachers that have shifted the argument about the privatization of public schools through things that you would call small and incremental. They're things that have long roots in the past and don't involve big, exciting technological innovations, yet they have real and immediate impacts on the realities of the buildings and the rooms and the tools with which people are learning. And I think that Fifth Dimension is a nice example of something that could be called radical and creating radically different learning environments that could be seen as having happened suddenly in a big way, or as percolating slowly over decades. Neither one of those is the right or the wrong way to look at that. And I think that it is a sort of a technocentric, future-centric way of thinking that says small and incremental and slow is one thing, and big, technological, and fast is different. That's all. I'm not buying it, I guess.
Well, I think you have a valid argument there, Josh, and it's clear that from what you said earlier and what you said just now, that we, or at least I, need to have a little more sophisticated vocabulary to talk about this complex, timey-wimey thing.
Well, I think you put it in the community, and it's why Jan was excited and I was excited when the paper came along, and why the reviewers were excited to engage in this really fantastic discussion of your paper as it evolved over the revisions, is that people recognize the need to think about time and history and these historical narratives of history, how we talk about history. I think we're beginning to have those conversations, and this is one of them. I really value it.